Is Miami going to be the next team to leave the ACC? Let's talk about it with Alex Donno, host of Locked On Canes, joining me here on Locked On College Football. Do they need to get out of the ACC with this announcement from Clemson that they, like Florida State, are suing the league to get out of it? If those teams are successful, which is not necessarily guaranteed, does Miami need to start ponying up the cash and calling lawyers?
Yes, and I think it's because of the revenue gap. I mean, if you look at the amount of money, not only based on conference TV payouts, because the ACC grant of rights agreement is so bad. That's why these teams won out in the first place, because they jumped the gun and signed a deal that takes them through 2036, not anticipating how the market would grow and change over the years. So the ACC is stuck with this awful TV deal. So the TV deals, of course, are much better in the new super conferences in the Big Ten and the SEC. They also get a significantly larger cut of the new college football playoff revenue with the new ACC, with the new ESPN deal that was just inked. So I don't believe you can realistically compete with the top teams from the Power Two if you're not in the Power Two, because I do know some folks, Spencer, down here in Miami who cover the program pretty closely, and I don't necessarily agree with this sentiment, but there is some feeling that, hey, with the playoff, being expanded from 12 and it's going to be up at 14 in just a couple of years, that maybe it's not so bad. Hope trying to be a bigger fish in a small pond, because you can still get a playoff spot as long as you have donors who are, maybe closing the gap between the lost TV revenue. But I just don't know how sustainable that is. Like, if you're, first of all, it's harder to recruit. Like, if you're trying to convince top players, and obviously Miami is, as you know, Mario Cristobal very well, how competitive he is from a recruiting standpoint. Miami is always trying to recruit against SEC and Big Ten programs. And as the gap widens, it becomes harder to recruit against teams like that. Not to mention the idea of maybe trying to rely on donors to try to bridge the TV revenue gap. I don't know how reliable of a system that is. So yes, I think that if Florida State, who already has at least 1 foot out the door, and Clemson, who's trying to put a foot out the door, if those two teams who have been the bell cows in the ACC for a while now, if they find a way out, Miami definitely has to find a way out.
I think the ACC, is capable of continuing. It's just a matter of whether or not those teams can succeed. I mean, the Big 12 lost their two biggest teams, Texas and Oklahoma. They're still here. Now, they benefited, of course, from the Pac-12 collapsing, but even before that happened, the Big 12 was still poised to, have, at least in the short term, a plan forward to be the next power conference, or one of the next power conferences at the highest level of the sport. What I wonder about when you discuss the revenues and whatnot is what number does it become, what number is significant, right? So if you've got a media rights gap between this conference schools and that conference's schools, and let's say Miami's got more prominent boosters than one of the big brands in the Big Ten or the SEC. And if they're at a media rights revenue of $60 million, but the boosters can make up, 20, just throwing a number out there. I have no idea what their fundraising numbers look like and such. What amount is too much to overcome? Is it $10 million for your department? Is it 20? Is it 30? Because the money doesn't go exclusively to football. It'll go to other sports and to fund various aspects of the athletic department as well. So what amount do you think, or is there a hard number that you look at and say, yeah, getting $36 million on average from the ACC compared to, $90 million in the Big Ten or $80 million in the SEC, yeah, that's just too big of a gap. But what number do they need to remain financially competitive?
It's a great question, and I have talked about this with people before, just spitballing, right? Because and I'm not the one ponying up millions. Believe me, I donate small amounts here and there. What I
Locked On pays us very well and very fairly, but it is not at that level, not yet anyway. Give us a couple decades hosting these shows, and we'll get it churning.
That is well said. But when I've had conversations about what these booster numbers would be, or not even boosters, donors, I think is the better word to describe it. I think that 30 to 40 million, I think, is a number that maybe could be ponied up by various folks around the program to help close that gap a little bit. But if what you need is more than that, I think it becomes unrealistic. And then the other thing about this always comes back to recruiting to me. And I know it's not necessarily the biggest hurdle, but it's a symptom of what would happen if you're not in the Power 2 3-4 years from now, assuming there's going to be an even further expansion. Because one of the things, Spencer, and Miami has done pretty well the last couple of years when it comes to bringing in top 10 recruiting classes, but I still every now and then I talk to top players that Miami's recruiting, and I have conversations, and you always every now and then run into players who it's like, man, I really like Miami, I want to be there, but I really want to be in the SEC. Like when Miami tries to recruit certain players who, come from the state of Mississippi and Alabama, like it's just very difficult. Georgia, they've had some success in recently, but it's hard to sometimes bridge that gap. And I'm sure that the Big Ten, now that they're building more of a national footprint, Miami's going to run it. And Ohio State is a school that Miami actually does recruit against a lot. They've won some battles. They've lost some battles there. So to me, if there already are certain players who are like, I want to be in the Big Ten or the SEC, that is only going to get more prominent now that those conferences are becoming bigger and they're becoming monsters. So there are obviously selling points to Miami in terms of, the weather, the international city and all that. And so certain players maybe don't care as much about being in a power conference, but it definitely is an issue with some, and it's going to become an even bigger issue. So even if you are able to get donors to step up and help you bridge some of that financial gap that you're losing from the TV deals, you still have the elephant in the room if you're in a diminished ACC and you're recruited. If assuming Florida State gets into the Power 2 and Florida obviously is already in the SEC, you recruit against those schools pretty heavily. That would only make it more difficult to win some of those heated recruiting battles.
Where does Miami fit better, the SEC or the Big Ten?
Oh man, I've had so many heated debates about this, and I've gone a little bit back and forth. I still, at the end of the day, I still think the SEC it's the better football fit, whereas the Big Ten might be the better overall fit administratively, because Miami does take their academics very seriously. They have AAU designation, which the vast majority of Big Ten members have. Whereas the SEC, there obviously are some really good academic institutions there, but it's not really the same focus as it is in the Big Ten. But I like the geography so much better for Miami, because now the Big Ten is a coast to coast thing, whereas the SEC, for as powerful of a conference it is, it really doesn't go much farther west than Texas over to the East Coast. And, you could be able to maybe resume a rivalry with Florida, which used to be a thing back when I was a little kid. They play each other occasionally, but it's not a year-to-year thing like it used to be. So I think the SEC is the better football fit, but the Big Ten, not to say it's a bad football fit, but it's probably the better overall administrative fit.
So last thing here before we get you out of here, Donno, when you think about the next steps for Miami, what does that look like to you? What does the administration, the university, the athletic department, how are they going to try and position themselves? Are they just getting their legal team together and saying, get ready to give us a bunch of billable hours because you need to put together a lawsuit that's on par with what Florida State and Clemson are doing?
That's how I imagine this playing out. And I can only give you what I imagine, Spencer, because Miami has been so tight-lipped about this. The same way I'm sure Clemson was being really tight-lipped about it before they filed suit against the ACC on Tuesday. But now you hear rumors and rumblings where Florida State was obviously the first. They were the most angry about everything going on with the grant of rights. Clemson has now jumped on board. Based on the rumblings I hear, it sounds like North Carolina might be next, that they might be the third to go after the ACC, and then potentially Miami could be the fourth after that. Miami's been a lot more reactionary to this than Florida State obviously was, very, very angry with everything going on in the as we all should be, I think. But Florida State, they were the ones who got ahead of the curve on this. And I think a lot of other institutions are kind of waiting to see how things go, and they're waiting for Florida State and now Clemson to set the precedent. I wouldn't be shocked if Miami comes on board with this eventually, because I can't imagine, especially with the idea of the ACC losing potentially 2 or 3 of their most prominent programs, I can't imagine Miami is just going to be content to stick around and do nothing.
Alex Donno, Locked On Canes. Check him out on YouTube and wherever you get your podcasts as well. Alex, great stuff as always. Thanks so much.
Always a pleasure, Spencer. Thank you for having me.
ESPN has got all of the media rights for the college football playoff. That might mean something that you already know.